They called her nothing, humiliated her in front of everyone at a glittering gala, even recorded videos to mock her, convinced she didn't belong. But with one phone call, everything flipped. That black woman wasn't just a guest. She held the $5 billion deal that could save their dynasty. And right before their eyes, she tore it apart, bringing their empire crashing down in ashes. The marble steps leading into the Metropolitan Art Hall glistened under the floodlights, polished so carefully they mirrored the long gowns and black tuxedos of New York's elite. Chauffeurs in pressed uniforms opened car doors one after another, guiding jewels and silk into the night's most anticipated charity gala. Inside, waiters carried trays of champagne, and the muted sound of a string quartet floated across the cavernous lobby. It was an evening built on spectacle, wealth parading itself as generosity. Maya Carter climbed those same steps, her white gown trailing behind her like a river of light. She wasn't dripping in diamonds, but her elegance was undeniable, the kind that came from poise rather than decoration. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her chin lifted, her stride steady. To most of the room, though, she was invisible. A black woman walking alone into a room full of heirs who had never considered people who looked like her as equals. She had barely crossed the threshold before the whispers began. A cluster of young men near the auction tables, heirs with champagne glasses clinking loosely in their hands, turned their heads in unison. William Lancaster, tall and broad-shouldered with the careless arrogance of someone who had never faced consequences, smirked. His sister Victoria stood beside him in a glittering gold dress, her smile sharp as glass. "Well, would you look at that?" William said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Did the museum hire extra staff tonight? Because I swear someone just wandered in from the service entrance." His friends laughed. Victoria's voice followed, syrupy sweet, laced with cruelty. "No, William, don't be mean. She's probably just lost. Poor thing probably thought this was a community center fundraiser." More laughter erupted, spilling like broken glass across the marble. Maya froze for half a second, feeling every eye turned toward her. The air tightened. Phones lifted discreetly, or not discreetly at all. Guests held them high, recording, snapping pictures, feeding their amusement. The gala had barely begun, and already she was the evening's spectacle. She straightened her shoulders and kept walking, every step deliberate. But the comments didn't stop. A woman in a sequin dress whispered loudly enough to be heard, "How embarrassing, showing up here as if she belongs." Another guest shook his head with mock pity. "Someone should point her back to the catering staff before she breaks something." Maya reached the center of the lobby, where chandeliers cast golden light down upon her. For a moment she hoped the room would quiet, that people would turn back to their conversations and give her peace. Instead, William raised his glass high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming, "tonight's entertainment has arrived early. Who ordered the help?" His words set the crowd ablaze. Laughter roared, cruel and unrestrained. Champagne sloshed over the rims of crystal flutes as men and women doubled over at a joke that wasn't even clever, only cruel. Maya's cheeks burned, but not from shame. She had been here before, in different rooms, on different nights, in different forms. She remembered school dances where she was told the tickets were sold out, while white classmates breezed in. She remembered job interviews where her resume was praised, but her presence dismissed. The echoes of those nights rushed back, threatening to suffocate her. Still, she held her ground. She fixed her gaze ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Her voice, calm and low, cut through the noise. "Excuse me, could someone tell me where the seating chart is posted?" For a second, silence fell. Then Victoria let out a laugh so sharp it drew blood. "Seating chart? Oh, sweetheart, you don't get a seat. Not here. Unless, of course, you're sitting with the staff in the kitchen." The circle around her howled. A waiter passed with a tray of glasses. Maya reached gently, desperate for something to hold, a sip of water to anchor her. But before she could touch one, the waiter glanced toward Victoria, who shook her head ever so slightly. The tray turned away. The rejection stung more than the words. Maya's throat tightened, but she would not break. She would not give them that. She let her hand fall back to her side and inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling against the white silk that was quickly becoming a target. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Stand tall, Maya." Just stand tall." Then, as if on cue, Victoria accidentally bumped into her, the stem of her champagne glass tilting forward. Cold liquid splashed across Maya's gown, soaking the white fabric in sticky sweetness. Victoria gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God, I am so clumsy," she declared, though her eyes glittered with victory. "I really hope that dress wasn't expensive." The room erupted again. Phones shot upward. Someone shouted, "Post it! Post it now!" Laughter swelled until it drowned out the quartet. Guests who had been admiring paintings only minutes before now gathered, circling closer, their eyes alight with cruel fascination. Maya stood in the center of it, soaked, humiliated, yet refusing to crumble. Her fingers curled around the fabric of her ruined gown, squeezing hard enough that her knuckles turned white. She forced her shoulders back and lifted her chin higher. She looked at William, at Victoria, at the dozens of faces twisted in ugly delight, and she said nothing. But inside her, something shifted. It was a familiar burn, the heat of every insult she had swallowed, every door that had been closed in her face, every sneer that told her she wasn't enough. Tonight they thought they were writing her humiliation. Tonight they thought she was the joke. But Maya Carter knew the truth. The night was only beginning. And before it ended, every single person laughing at her would learn the cost of cruelty. Hours earlier, before the golden chandeliers and cruel laughter, the night had begun at the entrance. A sharp wind swept through Fifth Avenue, sending scraps of paper tumbling down the sidewalk and rattling the iron gates of the Metropolitan Art Hall. Maya Carter stepped out of her car, her gown protected by a wool coat, her breath visible in the frigid November air. She clutched her invitation carefully, embossed in silver ink, a card that symbolized her rightful place inside. She had looked forward to this evening for weeks, not as a spectacle, but as a celebration of art and generosity. The first sign came quickly. As she approached the main doors, a young man in a crisp black security jacket shifted into her path. He didn't smile the way she had seen him smile at the previous guest, a white man who breezed through while still laughing into his phone. Instead, the guard's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes traveled over Maya, from her hair to her shoes, as if cataloging her. "Invitation," he said curtly. She offered it with steady hands, watching his eyes narrow as he read the name, Maya Carter. He glanced at the list on his clipboard, then back at her, his suspicion obvious. "You'll need to step aside, ma'am. I need to check this." Maya frowned softly. "I just saw you wave 3 people in without checking anything." His jaw tightened. "Standard procedure," he muttered, but they both knew it wasn't. The guests ahead hadn't even slowed their stride. Maya followed his gesture toward a roped-off section beside the entrance. It wasn't sheltered from the wind. Her heels clicked against the stone as she moved aside, her dignity intact but her stomach heavy. Minutes turned into 20. She stood watching one guest after another approach, each welcomed with warmth. A woman in a fur coat barely pulled her invitation from her purse before she was ushered inside. A man in a tuxedo offered nothing more than a flash of paper, and the guard's voice turned honey-sweet. "Welcome, sir. Enjoy the evening." The cold seeped through Maya's coat, biting her arms and legs, but the indignity stung worse than the air. A voice came from nearby, soft but deliberate. "This isn't right." Maya turned to see a young woman holding a camera strapped around her neck. Her brown hair whipped across her face in the wind, but her eyes were sharp, observant. She was no guest. Her press badge hung just below her coat lapel. Maya offered a faint smile, trying to wave it off. "I've been through worse. It's just one night." The young woman shook her head. One night too many. She lifted her phone discreetly, pretending to check messages, but Maya caught the red recording dot. She was filming, documenting the hypocrisy unfolding at the doors. Another 20 minutes dragged by. The guard returned, his tone falsely apologetic. "Still checking, ma'am. Management has to confirm." Then he drifted away, chuckling with another guard, not making a single call. Maya's toes grew numb inside her heels. She pressed her lips together, refusing to shiver, refusing to show weakness. Couples walked past laughing, the women adjusting pearl necklaces, the men loosening scarves. None of them stopped. None questioned why she stood waiting while the line flowed seamlessly. One man even muttered to his companion as they passed, "Some people just don't know their place." The words pierced deeper than the wind. The young reporter stepped closer, her breath forming small clouds. "I'm Eliza," she whispered, her tone conspiratorial. "This will matter later, I promise you." Maya studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She didn't know why she believed her, but she did. By the time the guard finally returned with her invitation, 2 full hours had passed. "Everything checks out," he said casually, as though nothing had happened, handing her card back without apology. "You can go in now." Maya accepted it, her fingers stiff from the cold. She wanted to speak, to call out the injustice, to demand an explanation. But she held back. Not here, not yet. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked toward the doors, her heels echoing across the stone like a slow drumbeat. Inside, warmth and laughter spilled from the grand foyer, a different world entirely from the freezing pavement outside. To the guests inside, the night was only beginning. For Maya Carter, it already felt like a battle she hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. And unseen to everyone else, Eliza's short video had begun its journey across social media. Within minutes, it would spread beyond the museum steps, gathering speed and fury. The humiliation forced on Maya Carter at the door would soon ignite something much larger, something the Lancaster family could never have anticipated. The moment Maya stepped into the main gallery, warmth wrapped around her like a velvet curtain. The chatter of hundreds of guests rose and fell beneath the glow of chandeliers, their laughter carrying over the polished wood floors and echoing against the vaulted ceiling. She paused for a heartbeat, drawing in the scene, willing herself to settle after 2 hours in the cold. Her gown, once pristine, bore faint wrinkles from the weight outside, and her hands still tingled from the chill. She wanted, just for a moment, to disappear into the art on the walls, the canvases older than most nations. But her presence had already been marked. Victoria Lancaster noticed her first. Draped in gold sequins that shimmered with every step, she cut a path across the room like a queen surveying her court. Her smile, wide and polished, carried the unmistakable flavor of malice. "Well, look who finally made it inside," she called, her voice carrying farther than it needed to. Several heads turned, conversations pausing mid-sentence. William, holding a glass of champagne, smirked and sauntered to his sister's side. Took her long enough? Did security lose the broom closet keys? His friends burst into laughter, the kind that didn't die down but swelled as others joined, sensing the entertainment. Maya tightened her grip on her clutch. Her instincts screamed to walk away, to find her table, to avoid this trap. But before she could step past, Victoria moved in closer, feigning warmth. "Oh, don't look so tense. We're only joking." She tilted her glass ever so slightly, and in one graceful flick, a stream of champagne splashed across Maya's gown. Gasps followed, then laughter louder than before. Maya stiffened, looking down at the liquid spreading across her dress. The fabric clung cold to her skin, the sticky scent of alcohol rising in the air. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Victoria's grin. "My apologies," Victoria said, her tone sugary sweet. "So terribly clumsy of me." Her friends clapped mockingly, one of them adding, "Maybe she's better suited to mop it up herself." Maya drew a steady breath, forcing her voice to stay calm. "It was an accident, I'm sure." William leaned in, his breath heavy with liquor. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that, but spirit doesn't buy you a seat at this table." He motioned toward the auction platform, where priceless works of art were being displayed. "You came to bid? Please, these paintings cost more than your house." The crowd roared again, and someone snapped a photo, the flash sharp against Maya's eyes. She turned toward the bar, aching for water, for anything to ground her. But the bartender, a young man in a neat vest, glanced quickly toward Victoria before shaking his head. "Sorry, miss," he muttered, pulling the tray away. The refusal sliced deeper than the champagne had. She wasn't just unwelcome. She was being denied the smallest kindnesses at their command. She stood for a moment, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, the same words she had whispered on nights when the world seemed cruelest. "Don't let them take your dignity, Maya. They can strip everything else, but not that." William raised his glass once more, his words slurred but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, here we are, New York's finest, graced with unexpected company. Maybe she wandered in from the kitchen. Maybe she's here to collect tips. The laughter this time was merciless, spreading across the gallery like wildfire. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. She would not cry. She would not plead. She lifted her chin, her eyes calm but sharp, and stared straight at the Lancasters. For the first time, the siblings faltered, caught off guard by the quiet fire in her gaze. Yet the crowd's jeers pushed them back into performance, their cruelty renewed. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for Maya to hear, though her smile never faded. "You'll regret showing up tonight. This isn't your world. It never will be." Then she turned away, laughing again as though she had delivered the line of the night. Maya stood still, her gown damp, her throat parched, her heart steadying itself against the storm. Around her, the room pulsed with wealth and arrogance, a masquerade of civility hiding knives in every smile. They thought they had broken her already, that she would retreat, diminished and small. But Maya Carter remained upright, the steel in her spine unbent. She told herself again, silently, firmly, "Stand tall." The night isn't finished yet. And as the music swelled and the laughter resumed, no one there realized that their cruelty had planted the seed of their own undoing. The gala had settled into its rhythm, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling as priceless paintings were carried across the stage, yet the room's true attention wasn't on the art. Eyes drifted again and again toward the corner where Maya Carter stood, her gown still damp from champagne, her shoulders squared as if she were bracing herself against a storm. She had chosen to remain at the edge of the gallery, trying to blend into the sea of sequins and tuxedos, but the cruelty in the air was relentless. Guests glanced her way and whispered behind gloved hands, their words barbed and meant to wound. A young couple passing near her slowed just enough for the man to mutter, "She's really trying to act like she belongs here. Can you believe that?" His companion stifled a laugh, replying, "The audacity! It's breathtaking." Maya clasped her hands tightly together, willing herself to remain calm, but every word found its mark. She caught the bartender's eye once more, quietly asking, "Please, may I have a glass of water?" The young man hesitated, torn between decency and the authority of the Lancasters. His eyes flickered toward Victoria, who was laughing across the room, and then he shook his head quickly before turning away. The rejection burned like a brand. Even water, simple, essential, human, was being denied to her as if she were less than the rest of them. Victoria must have sensed the moment because she glided across the marble floor toward Maya, her smile dazzling, her voice pitched loud enough to carry. "Oh, sweetheart, still here? I would have thought you'd have left by now. We wouldn't have blamed you. It can't be easy being out of place." Her companions chuckled, one of them lifting a phone to record. Maya felt the heat of the camera's red light on her skin. Victoria tilted her head, feigning concern. "You know, I really should apologize again. It was clumsy of me, spilling on your dress like that." She reached out as if to adjust the stained fabric, but with a swift, deliberate step, she brushed her heel against Maya's, sending her stumbling back against a chair. The crowd gasped, not in sympathy but in anticipation, and then laughter followed, booming through the hall. "Oh my goodness," Victoria exclaimed theatrically, clasping her hands to her chest. "Are you all right? You really must be more careful. These gowns are delicate." Phones shot upward, the bright light of flashes popping like fireworks. Guests didn't just watch, they documented, desperate to capture the humiliation to share later like a party favor. Maya steadied herself, her cheeks burning, but she refused to fall. She straightened, smoothed her dress with trembling hands, and locked eyes with Victoria. There was no anger in her gaze, only the icy calm of someone storing every moment deep inside. From across the gallery, William raised his glass again. "Careful, Victoria," he slurred, his words heavy with liquor. "You'll spoil the entertainment. We don't want the fun to end too soon." His friends erupted, clinking glasses and shouting encouragement. "Give her a mop!" someone yelled. "Better yet, a tray! Let her serve us!" The cruelty spiraled, each insult louder than the last. Maya's throat ached with unshed words. She wanted to shout, to tell them who she was, what she represented, the power she held in her hands. But she stayed silent. Not yet. Not like this. If she had learned anything in her climb to the top, it was that timing was everything. She would not waste her truth on ears too deafened by arrogance to hear it. For over an hour, the cycle continued. Guests walked by, tossing insults just loud enough for her to catch. Is she still here? Shouldn't security have escorted her out? Imagine the nerve trying to mingle with us. Their laughter became the soundtrack of her solitude, cruel and unrelenting. Some approached her corner as though inspecting a curiosity in a museum, their gazes lingering with the same cold fascination one might give an exotic animal. And yet, through it all, Maya did not leave. She stood, enduring, her spine straight, her silence a weapon they couldn't understand. Around her, the gala swirled on. Champagne flowed, jewels glittered, paintings sold for sums larger than most people would see in a lifetime. But the real show, the one that every phone in the room had captured, was the quiet degradation of a single woman. At one point, Brandon Lancaster, already glassy-eyed from too much drink, staggered over to join the chorus. He waved his phone in Maya's face, chuckling. Smile for the camera. You'll be famous by morning. His friends howled, urging him on, their laughter echoing against the marble like the jeers of a mob. He leaned close enough for Maya to smell the alcohol on his breath. Don't worry, he whispered mockingly. This is the best thing you'll ever be known for. Maya stared at him, unflinching, her silence heavier than any insult she could have given. Brandon pulled back, unnerved for just a second, before shaking it off with another loud laugh and stumbling back to his circle of friends. The hour dragged on, each minute an eternity. Her feet ached from standing, her body chilled beneath the damp fabric of her gown, but she did not falter. In that corner, mocked and diminished, she found something she hadn't expected: clarity. Every sneer, every cruel joke, every denial was fuel. They believed they were breaking her, but they were only sharpening her resolve. As the auctioneer's gavel struck once more, marking the sale of yet another masterpiece, Maya lifted her chin. Her gaze swept across the room, past the sneering faces, past the flashing phones, and she thought of the irony. These people, drunk on their own superiority, had no idea whose hands held the future of their family, their fortune, their legacy. The laughter rolled on, cruel and careless, but somewhere deep within Maya the balance had already shifted. Tonight was not their victory, it was their reckoning in disguise. And though no one else in that glittering hall realized it yet, the woman they had chosen as their entertainment would soon become the author of their ruin. The music swelled, and laughter ricocheted through the grand gallery, but Maya barely heard any of it. She had tucked herself into the far end of the hall, near a column where the shadows softened the harsh glare of chandeliers. Her dress was still stained, the sticky sweetness of wine clinging to the fabric, but she didn't fuss with it anymore. She stood still, her hands resting lightly against her clutch, her gaze fixed on the paintings lining the walls. They weren't just decorations to her. They were windows into survival, resilience, and beauty, each brushstroke layered with the kind of dignity her tormentors could never understand. Her eyes lingered on one in particular, a dark canvas of storm clouds breaking over a small boat. Something in that painting mirrored her heart, battered, isolated, but still afloat. The voices of William and Victoria carried across the hall, loud, smug, and theatrical. They were telling some story about their vacations in the south of France, but every so often Maya felt their eyes drift back to her, checking to see if she was still standing, still enduring. She gave them nothing. She would not bend to their spectacle. Instead, her mind drifted inward, unspooling memories she had carried quietly for years. She saw her grandmother again, the woman who had raised her in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Newark. Late nights of folding towels for extra pay, of counting change in glass jars to cover bills, of whispered prayers over kitchen tables lit only by a single bulb. Her grandmother's hands, worn and rough, always managed to smooth Maya's hair as she told her, "Don't let them take your dignity, baby girl. They can laugh at your clothes, your skin, your voice. But dignity, that's yours to keep." Maya remembered those words every time life tried to strip her bare. At 16, when her teacher suggested she should aim lower on her college applications. At 22, when the first bank laughed at her proposal for a business loan. At 29, when a man in a boardroom called her sweetheart and dismissed her projections only to lose millions by ignoring them. Each slight had carved her sharper, not smaller. She exhaled slowly, pulling herself back into the present, back into the room that had been turned into a stage for her humiliation. A pair of older women walked past her, clutching their purses tightly, as though her presence itself was a threat. One muttered, "She must be here to clean up after the dinner." The other chuckled, "Well, someone has to." Their words rolled off her like cold rain, familiar in their cruelty. She closed her eyes for a moment, reminding herself who she was now. Not that girl counting coins at a laundromat table. Not the young woman begging for a chance in rooms full of men who had already decided she was unworthy. She opened her eyes and let them rest on the crowd again. They thought they knew her story, an outsider, a nobody who had wandered into their gilded circle. But the truth was she had built something they couldn't imagine, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Carter Global Holdings was more than a company. It was her life's testament. She had started it with nothing but determination, working out of a rented office above a dry cleaner with second-hand furniture and an old desktop computer. She remembered typing up proposals late into the night, her grandmother asleep in the next room, the radiator rattling like an old man's cough. And she remembered the first contract she ever won, the first check that proved her dream wasn't foolish, the moment she realized she could create an empire that no one could take from her. Now, that empire stretched across industries, technology, real estate, infrastructure. Tens of thousands of employees depended on her decisions. Fortune 500 companies courted her partnerships. She was worth more than the chandeliers glittering overhead, more than the art being auctioned off, more than the Lancasters and their heirs could ever boast. But none of that mattered to them. To them, she was still only what their eyes told them, a black woman standing alone in their space, to be mocked and dismissed. Her phone vibrated in her clutch, the faint hum breaking her reflection. She pulled it out discreetly and glanced at the screen. A message from her assistant, confirming that the Lancaster deal, the $5 billion partnership that was supposed to save their empire, was ready to finalize. She stared at the words, her lips pressing together. How ironic, she thought, that tonight she stood here as their plaything, when in reality she held their salvation in the palm of her hand. A waiter passed by again, his tray clinking with untouched glasses of water. Maya lifted her gaze to him, and for a brief second their eyes met. He hesitated, his steps faltering, but then his eyes darted toward Victoria across the room, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly before moving on. Maya watched him go, her throat dry but her resolve deepening. If even kindness could be controlled, if even water could be withheld, then these people were more desperate to prove their superiority than she had ever imagined. She turned back to the storm painting. The boat still floated, fragile but unbroken, carrying itself through waves meant to sink it. A quiet strength stirred within her chest. She whispered to herself, words only she could hear. "Stand tall, Maya. Just stand tall." A man nearby, overhearing only her tone, smirked and muttered, "Talking to herself now. How pathetic." His date giggled, leaning into him. Maya didn't even glance at them. Their laughter no longer pierced. It only echoed. She had lived through worse storms. In that corner, beneath the weight of ridicule, she felt her grandmother's hands again, guiding her, grounding her. They thought tonight was her breaking point, but Maya knew better. Tonight was the night the storm inside her would finally break open. They had no idea what was coming, no inkling that their cruelty was chiseling the edge of their own downfall. As the gavel struck on stage, announcing the sale of another painting, Maya squared her shoulders. Her eyes, calm but resolute, scanned the crowd. Every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every withheld kindness, they had all been stored like ammunition. The heirs thought they were writing the story of her humiliation, but she was already preparing the story of their undoing. And when the time came, it would be written in letters bold enough that even they could not ignore it. The storm painting glimmered under the chandelier's light, its tiny boat still holding fast against the waves. Maya breathed deeply, steady and strong. She was that boat. She had always been that boat. And just as every storm she had faced before had only proven her strength, this one would too. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. She didn't answer it yet. Not now. Timing was everything. And tonight the storm would wait for the perfect moment to strike. The laughter hadn't yet faded when Maya's phone rang. The sound was soft at first, muffled by the layers of chatter, but as she pulled it from her clutch and the screen lit up in her hand, it seemed to cut through the entire hall. Heads turned, not because they cared who might be calling her, but because it was one more chance to laugh, one more prop in the evening's cruel performance. William raised his glass again, sneering. Careful, folks. She might be calling her ride home. Uber Black, maybe? The crowd chuckled on cue. Maya looked at the name glowing on her screen and felt her heart steady. The number was familiar, the direct line of her chief counsel, someone who never called unless it was urgent. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice calm, almost serene. This is Maya. The room shifted, if only slightly, as those nearest to her caught the tone in her voice. It wasn't flustered or embarrassed, the way they expected. It was professional, crisp, the kind of voice used by someone accustomed to making decisions that moved empires. On the other end, her counsel's voice was clear, almost loud enough for others to overhear. Miss Carter, the Lancaster contracts are finalized. $5 billion in assets ready to sign tonight. Do you want me to bring the paperwork over to the Gala for announcement? A silence followed that sentence, heavier than anything the quartet could play. The guests closest to Maya froze, the laughter choking in their throats. They had heard the words, $5 billion, Lancaster contracts, finalized. It was a language they knew all too well. Money, deals, salvation. The sound of a lifeline dangling in the air. But the larger room still roared, blind to the revelation. Brandon was showing a video on his phone to his friends, cackling as they replayed Maya's earlier stumble. Victoria was posing for another photo, tilting her chin toward the chandelier light, her golden dress glittering for the cameras. Margaret Lancaster was recounting her own version of events to a circle of socialites, embellishing details until Maya was cast as a gatecrasher, a nuisance that had ruined her perfect evening. Maya held the phone closer, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She could see the ripple beginning. A handful of guests whispering to each other, eyebrows raised, suspicion dawning. Carter, one of them murmured. Did she say Carter Global? Another leaned closer, his smirk fading into something more unsettled. $5 billion? With the Lancasters? Her voice never wavered. No, she said softly into the phone, her eyes locked on the crowd. Don't bring anything here. I'll decide shortly. The words were deliberate, chosen not just for the person on the other end, but for the room itself. Every syllable dripped with a power that most of the guests had dismissed as impossible only minutes earlier. Her silence after she spoke was even louder than her words, leaving those who overheard desperate to fill it with meaning. One man near the bar, a hedge fund manager who prided himself on knowing every major player in the city, whispered urgently to his companion, Carter Global Holdings. That's not just any firm. They run half the infrastructure projects on the East Coast. His friend frowned, suddenly uneasy. And she just said Lancaster contracts. That's the rescue package they've been hinting at for months. The ripple grew wider. Guests who had been laughing seconds ago were suddenly checking their phones, searching names, pulling up headlines. A buzz began in the corners of the room, soft but undeniable. Still, the Lancasters themselves remained oblivious. William, drunk and emboldened, shouted across the floor, Don't worry, everyone. She's not making business calls. She's probably ordering room service. Maybe fries and a soda. His friends erupted in drunken laughter, but their voices rang hollow now, a little too loud, a little too forced. Some in the crowd no longer joined in. Maya lowered her phone, ending the call with deliberate calm. She didn't explain, didn't defend. She simply tucked it back into her clutch and lifted her chin. Her silence spoke louder than any retort. A few guests nearest her stepped back instinctively, as if her presence carried a weight they hadn't felt before. From across the hall, Eliza, the young reporter who had filmed Maya's ordeal at the door, stood with her camera lowered, her eyes wide. She had heard the call, every word of it. She wasn't laughing. She was recording something else now. Not humiliation, but revelation. Maya let the moment linger, watching the unease spread, watching the faces change. They still didn't know, not fully, but soon they would. The music swelled again, desperate to fill the silence that had cracked open. Glasses clinked, forced laughter rose, and the auctioneer's gavel struck another painting into someone's possession. But for those who had heard her phone call, The night was no longer a simple party. It was the edge of a precipice, and Maya Carter stood at its center, calm, patient, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal who she truly was. And though the room hadn't realized it yet, the show they thought they were enjoying had already shifted. The real performance was about to begin. The auctioneer's voice droned on about brushstrokes and provenance, but the weight in the room had shifted. It wasn't the art that held anyone's attention anymore. It was the woman in the corner with the ruined white gown and the phone still warm in her hand. The cruel laughter had lost its edge. A quiet murmur had taken its place, moving through the crowd like a draft no one could quite escape. Words like Carter and 5 billion floated on the air, whispered between jeweled ears and tuxedoed shoulders. Some faces carried confusion, others unease. The ripple was spreading. At the far side of the hall, Charles Lancaster stood stiffly beside a cluster of investors. His hair, white at the temples, was combed with the precision of a man desperate to hold on to appearances. He had been laughing moments earlier, boasting about the merger that was supposed to save his family's crumbling empire. But fragments of Maya's call reached him, carried on the hush of curious voices. Carter Global, Lancaster Contracts, 5 billion. The words turned his stomach cold. He excused himself clumsily, barely hearing the investors' goodbyes, and moved across the marble floor with a speed that betrayed his age. The smile he wore was cracked at the edges, forced, but his eyes told the truth. Panic. He reached the woman who stood straighter than anyone else in the room, the one his children had mocked so loudly. She didn't flinch as he approached. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice strained, almost breaking. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did you say Carter Global?" Maya turned slowly, her expression calm, her posture steady despite the stain across her dress. Her eyes met his, level and unwavering. She didn't raise her voice, but every person near enough to hear seemed to lean in unconsciously. "Yes," she replied simply. "Maya Carter, CEO of Carter Global Holdings." She slipped her hand into her clutch and pulled out a card, heavy stock, embossed in platinum foil. She held it out with grace, the way one might hand a glass of water to someone choking. For a moment Charles hesitated, then he reached with trembling fingers. He read the name once, then again, as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. The words blurred as his hand began to shake, the glass of wine in his other hand tilting until it slipped and shattered against the marble. The sound cut through the gallery like a gunshot. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The crowd hushed as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Margaret Lancaster rushed forward, her heels clicking like a drumbeat. "Charles, what is it? Why are you?" She snatched the card from his hand, irritation twisting her face. "Really, it's just a business card." But the moment her eyes found the name, her words collapsed. The color drained from her cheeks, her lips parted, and the proud steel in her posture faltered. Someone whispered loudly enough to echo, "She said 5 billion, with the Lancasters." And the murmur grew, weaving through the crowd until even those who hadn't heard the call were piecing it together. Guests stared at Maya with new eyes, not the mocking disdain of before, but the uneasy recognition that they had missed something vital, something catastrophic. Phones were lowered, smirks dissolved, and the laughter that had been the soundtrack of her humiliation died completely. Charles looked back at Maya, desperation swimming in his eyes. His voice was hoarse, broken. You're the Carter Global?" Maya held his gaze, her voice measured and steady. "The very one your family was counting on." The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria's hand, still holding her glass of champagne, shook just enough for the bubbles to slosh against the rim. William's smirk faltered, his drunken bravado flickering like a candle in wind. Brandon, still clutching his phone, lowered it slowly, his video forgotten. The audience that had jeered and recorded her humiliation moments ago now looked as though they were watching the ground crack beneath their feet. Maya slipped her card back into her clutch and straightened her shoulders. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need theatrics. The truth was heavy enough to bend the entire room toward it. For the first time that evening, she wasn't the one on display. The Lancasters were, and everyone could see the first crack in their carefully constructed empire. Charles tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. His lips opened and closed like a man drowning, gasping for air. Margaret clutched his arm, her eyes darting from Maya to the crowd, aware that their downfall was no longer a secret whispered in boardrooms, but a spectacle unraveling in real time. Maya said nothing more. She didn't need to. The silence she left in her wake was louder than any insult they had thrown at her. And as she turned her gaze back toward the storm painting on the wall, the irony wasn't lost on her. The storm wasn't hers anymore. It was theirs. And it had just begun. The hall was no longer alive with laughter. It pulsed with a strange silence, thick and unsteady, as though every breath had been sucked out of the room. Charles still clutched the edge of Maya's card as if it might burn him. Margaret's face was chalk white, and William and Victoria looked like children who had just realized their game had gone too far. Brandon's phone, once a weapon of ridicule, hung limp at his side. All around them, the crowd began to lean in, waiting, hungry for an explanation, for the truth behind the name that suddenly meant so much more than they had guessed. Maya's phone rang again. The sound cracked through the stillness like thunder, startling more than a few of the guests who had been straining to hear every word. She lifted it slowly, deliberately, her face calm, though her heart beat steady and strong. "Carter Global," she answered, her voice low but resonant, carrying across the room. Her counsel's voice came through, clear and urgent, as if the universe itself had chosen to announce the verdict to the crowd. "Miss Carter, everything's in place. The $5 billion merger, the infrastructure projects, the real estate transfers. Every document is ready for your signature. Should we proceed with delivery?" A tremor moved through the crowd like an earthquake. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers erupted, and the ripple of realization grew into a wave. They were no longer laughing. They were listening. Their eyes turned to Maya, waiting for her response, waiting to see what power looked like when spoken aloud by the woman they had mocked all evening. Maya took a breath. She let her eyes sweep across the room, meeting their stares, pausing on the faces that had jeered, the mouths that had hurled insults, the hands that had lifted phones to record her humiliation. She lingered on William's flushed face, Victoria's trembling smile, Brandon's glassy eyes, and finally on Charles and Margaret, whose entire legacy was balanced on the edge of her decision. Then she spoke, her words even and cold, every syllable like the strike of a hammer. "Cancel everything." The room seemed to lurch. Her counsel hesitated on the other end. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Did you say cancel?" "Cancel it all," Maya repeated, her gaze never wavering. "Every contract, every partnership, every cent of it." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that made every heartbeat audible. A few guests gasped, one woman dropping her clutch with a metallic clang that rang out in the stillness. A hedge fund manager near the bar muttered, "My God, she just killed the deal." His companion's face went pale, her wine glass trembling in her hand. On stage, the auctioneer faltered, his gavel frozen in the air, as if even he couldn't dare to strike against the weight of what had just happened. The quartet's music died mid-note, bows hovering above strings, every musician staring at Maya as though she had set the entire hall ablaze. Margaret finally found her voice, shrill and cracking under the weight of desperation. "You can't mean that. This is absurd. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Maya turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Charles stumbled forward, his composure unraveling, his voice breaking in front of the very people he had tried to impress. "Please, this is business, nothing more. Whatever's happened tonight, whatever offense you think was given, surely you can see this deal must go forward. My company, our family, depends on it." His words spilled out like water from a cracked glass, his dignity shattered with each plea. But Maya's calm was unshaken. She lifted the phone closer again. "Redirect the funds," she said, her voice steady and final. "Move every dollar into the Minority Business Partnership Fund. Spread it to Black entrepreneurs, Latino innovators, Asian American startups, Native-owned enterprises, all of it." Gasps rolled through the room, sharper than any laughter had been earlier. The magnitude of her words wasn't lost on anyone. It wasn't just rejection. It was redistribution. It was justice in motion. Brandon, still too drunk to understand the weight of the moment, barked out a bitter laugh. "This is insanity. You're just trying to humiliate us. You think you can ruin us because you're angry? This is reverse discrimination. That's what it is. Reverse racism. His voice cracked, and though he tried to sound defiant, even his friends pulled back, their faces twisted with horror at his stupidity. Maya's eyes cut toward him, sharp and cold as steel. This isn't racism. This is consequence. Learn the difference. Brandon's mouth shut as though the words had struck him physically. The silence that followed was deeper, more suffocating than before. The lawyer on the other end spoke again, his voice careful now. Understood, Miss Carter. I'll execute the cancellations and reallocations immediately. Do it now, Maya said, ending the call with a click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of her decision pressed down on everyone present, a collective realization dawning that they had just witnessed the destruction of a dynasty, not in courtrooms or board meetings, but here, in real time, in the very hall where they had once laughed at her. One by one, the guests who had jeered at Maya began to avert their eyes, their shame heavy and unmistakable. Others pulled out their phones, not to record her anymore, but to check news alerts, to confirm what they already feared. Social media was lighting up with the clip Eliza had uploaded earlier, now paired with whispers of the words 5 billion canceled. The gala had ceased to be a private playground. It was a public disaster, unraveling live before the eyes of the world. Maya stood at the center of it all, her white gown stained, her dignity intact, her silence now the most powerful sound in the room. They had tried to make her entertainment. Instead, she had delivered their sentence. And though none of them could admit it yet, every person in that room knew the truth. The Lancasters were finished. The silence that followed Maya's words was not stillness. It was suffocation. It pressed down on the room like the weight of a storm before it breaks, and for a moment no one seemed to know how to move, how to breathe. Then the ripple began. It started with a whisper near the bar, one man muttering to another, "She canceled it. She canceled 5 billion." His companion's face went pale, and then he repeated it to someone else. Within seconds, the entire gallery hummed with the same phrase, passed from one mouth to another like a contagion. 5 billion canceled. The Lancasters ruined. Guests who had been lounging comfortably in velvet chairs suddenly sat up straight, their glasses of champagne forgotten. Men who had laughed the loudest now glanced around nervously, calculating what this meant for their investments, their partnerships, their reputations. Women who had rolled their eyes at Maya's presence leaned closer to their companions, whispering with frantic urgency. The realization hit them one by one. This was not just a family's humiliation. It was contagion. Anyone too close to the Lancasters could be dragged under with them. Charles staggered forward, his face drained of all color, his composure gone. "Please," he said, his voice loud, almost breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't listen to this. It's a misunderstanding." His hand shook as he gestured toward Maya. She's bluffing. She can't." But even as he spoke, several guests were already pulling out their phones, their screens glowing in the dim light. Headlines appeared faster than he could deny them. Carter Global pulls plug on Lancaster deal. $5 billion merger canceled live at charity gala. Tweets and live posts spread like fire, many featuring the shaky footage Eliza had uploaded earlier from the museum steps. The story was already global, and Charles's protests were ashes before they left his mouth. One of the investors he had been entertaining earlier pushed back his chair and muttered, "I need to make a call." Another followed, and then another, until the cluster of supposed allies around him was gone. Margaret's eyes darted wildly, searching for someone to still hold their ground, but all she found were backs turned away, shoulders stiff with the urgency of escape. Across the room, William swayed slightly, his drunken haze giving way to a creeping dread. "She can't do this," he said, though it sounded less like conviction and more like prayer. "She can't just walk in here and ruin us." Victoria's golden smile was gone, replaced by a trembling mask. "But she has," she whispered, clutching his arm as though he could anchor her. "She has, and everyone knows it." Brandon, too drunk to read the room, barked out a bitter laugh, raising his phone again. "She's nothing. She's bluffing. I'll prove it." But his voice cracked, and no one laughed with him this time. His friends, once eager to egg him on, avoided his gaze, already inching toward the exits. His cruel confidence had curdled into the pathetic sound of a man digging his own grave. The panic spread like smoke. A hedge fund manager whispered that half his capital was tied up in Lancaster debt. A socialite realized the endowment she bragged about came through Lancaster channels. One by one, people who had clapped and cheered earlier slipped toward the doors, trying to escape the implosion before it stained them too. The marble foyer became a stream of glittering gowns and tuxedos, the once proud crowd scattering like startled birds. Maya watched it all from her corner, her face composed, her body steady. She hadn't moved an inch, but the room moved around her, bending to the gravity of her presence. She had said 3 words, cancel everything, and it was enough to unravel generations of arrogance in real time. Margaret finally snapped, her voice shrill as she lunged forward. "Stay!" she cried, her arms outstretched as though she could gather the fleeing guests by sheer force of will. "Don't you dare walk out on us! This is our gala, our name, our—" Her voice broke. The crowd didn't stop. They streamed past her as if she were invisible. The queen of Manhattan's social scene had been dethroned in an instant, and no one bothered to bow on their way out. Charles slumped against a chair, his shoulders shaking as the reality sank deeper with every departing guest. His empire had been fragile before tonight, its cracks hidden behind charm and borrowed money. But now the facade had shattered in the brightest spotlight possible, and there was no way to tape it back together. He covered his face with his hands, his chest heaving. William grabbed at him, desperate. "Father, do something," he hissed, his drunkenness vanishing in panic. "Say something! Fix it!" Charles lifted his face slowly, his eyes hollow. "You don't fix $5 billion. You don't fix her." His voice was a whisper, but it carried in the silence a truth that chilled every ear that heard it. Victoria let out a small sob, the sound childlike despite the diamonds glittering at her throat. Brandon muttered curses under his breath, but even he could feel the shift. The room wasn't theirs anymore. It hadn't been for a long time, though they were only now realizing it. In the corner, Eliza lowered her camera, her eyes wide with the gravity of what she had captured. She had come expecting another gala story, another shallow spread for the society pages. Instead, she had witnessed history, the precise moment when cruelty met its reckoning, when arrogance collapsed under the weight of its own rot. The last of the guests hurried out, leaving the hall eerily quiet. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead. The quartet's instruments rested silently on their laps, but the gala was over. The Lancasters had thrown their party to save their empire, and all it had done was reveal its funeral. Maya stood alone at the center of it all, not gloating, not triumphant, but steady. She had endured every humiliation, every cruel laugh, and she had given them only silence in return. Now her silence had become their ruin, and the chain of panic they had unleashed upon themselves was only beginning. The storm had broken, and nothing in that glittering hall would ever be the same again. The marble floor still glistened from spilled champagne and shattered glass, but the glitter of the gala had dulled. What remained was a hall hollowed out by shame, filled only with the Lancasters, a few stragglers who didn't know whether to stay or flee, and the woman they had spent hours trying to reduce to nothing. Maya stood tall, her ruined gown clinging to her frame, her face calm in the silence that had swallowed the evening whole. It was no longer laughter that echoed in those high ceilings. It was the weight of truth settling in. Margaret's voice, sharp and trembling, finally broke the stillness. "This is madness," she cried, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "One bad evening, one misunderstanding, cannot possibly erase generations of work. You can't punish us like this, not like this." Maya turned her head, her eyes cool as stone. "A misunderstanding?" Her voice was soft, but it traveled to every corner of the room. "Let me remind you of what you call a misunderstanding." She stepped forward, her heels clicking slowly against the marble, each step deliberate. "You called me wretched. You called me nothing. You denied me water when I asked politely. You told me I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. You laughed when your daughter poured wine on me, when your son mocked me, when your family turned me into entertainment for your guests. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was your truth. You showed me exactly who you are when you believed there would be no consequences." Her words fell like hammer blows, each one striking the Lancasters harder than the last. Charles shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of them. Margaret opened her mouth, but no defense came out. She pressed her lips shut, trembling under the force of being seen for what she was. Victoria lowered her head, the diamonds at her ears suddenly garish, her golden dress tarnished in the eyes of everyone left to witness the scene. William rubbed his temples, his earlier bravado reduced to a hollow shell. Brandon muttered something under his breath, but his words died when no one rallied to his side. Maya stopped in the center of the room, where the chandeliers cast her in light. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You thought I was powerless. You thought you could strip me of my dignity because you mistook silence for weakness. But you forgot something. She paused, her eyes locking onto each of them in turn. Silence remembers. Her gaze fell on Charles, and for the first time in the evening, the patriarch of the Lancaster family looked small. His shoulders hunched, his face creased not with authority, but with fear. You think tonight is just about your deal, Maya said, her tone cutting through him. It's not. Tonight is about every moment you and people like you have, but dignity was a privilege you could grant or deny. Tonight you learn it is not. The words struck harder than any contract shredded, any deal withdrawn. They weren't business terms, they were judgment. And the crowd that had lingered, those two stunned to leave, knew it. Their eyes darted between Maya and the Lancasters, watching an empire collapse not from numbers on a balance sheet, but from truth spoken plainly. Margaret tried one last time, desperation cracking her voice. We didn't know who you were. If we had known, if we had realized your position. Maya's expression hardened, her voice slicing through Margaret's plea. You knew I was human. That should have been enough. The room fell so quiet it seemed the chandeliers themselves held their breath. Even those who had thought to excuse the Lancasters could not escape the truth of that single sentence. It rang like a bell, pure and undeniable, vibrating in the marrow of everyone who heard it. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, her painted smile finally stripped away. William muttered, God, what have we done? Though no one answered him. Brandon slumped into a chair, his drunken haze broken by the chilling clarity of consequence. Charles stared at Maya as though she were not just a woman, but a mirror reflecting everything he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. Maya didn't move, didn't add another word. She didn't need to. Her silence after the verdict was its own kind of sentence, heavy and inescapable. The Lancasters had wanted her to be entertainment, to be their evening's joke. Instead, she had become their reckoning. The guests who still remained shifted uneasily, glancing toward the doors, whispering under their breath. Some of them would leave tonight and never again associate with the Lancasters. Others would pretend they hadn't laughed, hadn't joined in, but none of them could unhear what had just been spoken. None of them could ever look at the Lancaster name and not remember this night, the night their cruelty was laid bare and judged for what it was. Maya turned then, her gown brushing against the marble, the stain of wine marking her steps not as humiliation, but as proof of what she had endured. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to threaten. She had spoken her truth, and it had been enough to collapse an empire. Behind her, the Lancasters stood frozen in the wreckage of their own making, surrounded not by admirers, but by silence. The verdict had been delivered, and it would echo long after the last guest slipped into the cold night outside. The marble hall had turned into a stage no one could have imagined, and every chandelier above seemed to burn hotter as if to illuminate the truth that could no longer be hidden. Maya stood in the center, calm, her voice still hanging in the air from the last words she had spoken. She had already struck the blow that unraveled the Lancasters' empire, but what came next would turn their ruin into something the world would never forget. Victoria's voice broke the silence first, high-pitched and trembling, her golden dress quivering as if it no longer belonged on her body. This isn't justice, she cried, tears streaking the careful paint of her face. This is cruelty. You're punishing us because of who we are. Her words rang out shrill and desperate, the echo bouncing against the marble walls, but instead of rallying sympathy, they only exposed how little she understood. The crowd that remained shifted uneasily, some shaking their heads. Maya turned her eyes to Victoria, and the calm in her gaze cut deeper than any raised voice could have. "No," she said, steady and cold. "This isn't cruelty. This is consequence. Cruelty is what you enjoy tonight. Consequence is what follows when the bill comes due." The words landed like a stone tossed into a still lake. The ripples carried outward, through every guest still standing, through the quartet clutching their instruments, through the servers who had been forced to watch in silence while their employers mocked another human being. Eliza, the young reporter, held her camera tight, her eyes shining not with fear, but with the recognition that history was unfolding in front of her lens. Brandon, too drunk to gauge the depth of what had been spoken, pushed himself forward. His tie hung loose around his neck, his face flushed with liquor and entitlement. "You can't do this," he slurred, jabbing a finger at Maya, as though he could shrink her with a gesture. "You think you're powerful because you've got money? You're just another racist yourself. Reverse racism. That's what this is. You're tearing us apart because we're white." The words fell flat, absurd, even to those who might have once excused him. A groan rippled through the crowd, some gasps, some muffled curses of disbelief. Even William recoiled from his brother, muttering, "God, shut up!" But Brandon pressed on, stumbling closer, his glass nearly slipping from his hand. "We'll sue you. You hear me? You'll pay for this. You can't just destroy us because you're angry." Maya did not flinch. She only tilted her head slightly, almost as though she pitied him. Then she spoke, her voice low, her words precise. "This isn't racism, Brandon. This is accountability. Learn the difference." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter could have been. Brandon's mouth hung open, but no more words came. His chest rose and fell as though he'd been struck, and for the first time that night he seemed to understand the weight of what he'd done. He stumbled back, collapsing into a chair, muttering curses too soft to matter. Maya turned her attention back to her phone, her hand steady as she dialed again. The crowd leaned in, knowing now that every call she made reshaped the world. "Redirect every cent," she said into the line, her words deliberate. "The $5 billion we canceled tonight, it all goes into the Minority Business Partnership Fund. I want it dispersed to entrepreneurs who never got a chance in rooms like this. I want them to build what these people tried to deny me." Her voice carried, and though it was spoken into the receiver, everyone in the hall heard it. A woman in pearls gasped, covering her mouth. A man near the exit whispered to his companion, "She's not just ending them. She's building something new. She's rewriting the story." Maya ended the call, her hand lowering slowly, as if she were closing a door. The air buzzed with the hum of phones vibrating, of messages pouring in, of the outside world already consuming the story. Guests who had mocked her minutes earlier now looked at her as though they were standing before a judge, and perhaps they were. Margaret suddenly collapsed into a chair, her strength gone. Her voice came out ragged, almost pleading. "One night, one mistake. You can't erase us over one night." Maya turned toward her, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. "It wasn't one night, Margaret. It was every night like this. Every sneer, every door slammed shut on someone because of how they looked. Tonight, you made the mistake of doing it to someone who could answer back. And now, for once, you live with the cost." The last of the investors hurried out of the hall, their footsteps echoing like a funeral procession. The Lancasters were left exposed, their empire unraveling in the glare of chandeliers they no longer owned, their arrogance collapsing under the gaze of witnesses who would carry the story out into the world. Eliza raised her camera again, capturing Maya not as a victim, but as the image of strength itself. The wine-stained gown, the calm posture, the steel in her eyes, all of it would become the picture replayed on screens across the country. Maya Carter wasn't just canceling a deal. She was carving a lesson into history. In the heavy silence that followed, the Lancasters had nothing left to say. And for the first time, the crowd wasn't laughing, wasn't sneering, wasn't mocking. They were listening, truly listening, to a woman who had endured their cruelty and turned it into their downfall. The collapse was complete, but the echo of it had only begun. The hall that had once glowed with music and laughter stood hollow, a mausoleum of pride stripped bare. The Lancasters sat scattered in their own ruin. Charles hunched forward with his head in his hands. Margaret stiffened her chair, her face streaked with the ruin of smeared makeup, Victoria trembling quietly, and Brandon staring blankly into the glass he no longer had the courage to drink from. They looked nothing like the royalty of Manhattan society who had strutted through those doors hours earlier. They looked like what they truly were, ordinary people broken by their own arrogance, watching everything they had built slip through their fingers. Maya adjusted the strap of her stained gown, the fabric still clinging uncomfortably to her skin, but she moved with grace. She had endured the laughter, the humiliation, the cruel theater they had staged at her expense. Now she walked through the silence with dignity untouched. She paused near the grand staircase, her eyes sweeping the space once more. The marble gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, the paintings glowed under soft light. It was still beautiful, still opulent, but it no longer belonged to them. Margaret's voice cracked, sharp with desperation. "You can't take everything from us. It isn't fair. One night, one bad night doesn't erase 5 generations." Her hands gripped the edge of her chair until her knuckles whitened. "You've destroyed us, completely destroyed us." Maya turned, her expression calm but her eyes unyielding. "No, Margaret, I haven't destroyed you. You destroyed yourselves the moment you chose cruelty over decency. I just removed the pedestal you were standing on. You're not ruined. You're simply no longer standing on my back to feel taller." The words landed with the quiet force of truth. Margaret's shoulders sagged, and the fight drained out of her. Charles tried once more, his voice rough, a shadow of the booming authority he once carried. He sank to his knees on the marble, his hands outstretched, his body broken. "Please, Miss Carter," he whispered, the title on his tongue, an acknowledgement of a respect he had denied her until it was too late. "Don't take it all. My children, my wife, they'll have nothing." His voice broke into sobs. "I beg you, show mercy." Maya looked down at him, her face unreadable. Once she might have pitied him, once she might have softened, but tonight was not about pity, it was about truth. "You knew I was human, Charles," she said, her voice even, steady. "That should have been enough." She let the words linger, then turned toward the doors. Her heels echoed in the hollow hall, the only sound besides the faint sobs behind her. At the threshold she paused, her hand resting on the heavy brass handle. She glanced back one final time, her gaze sweeping over the family that had mocked her, degraded her, laughed at her suffering. "Some lessons are expensive," she said softly, but loud enough for every ear to hear. "This one cost you everything you thought you were." And with that, she opened the door and walked into the night. Outside, the city was alive. News vans already crowded the curb, reporters clutching microphones, camera lights piercing the darkness. Eliza stood among them, her phone still warm in her hand, the video she had recorded now flooding every corner of the internet. She caught sight of Maya stepping into the cool air, her stained dress glowing under the street lamps like a banner of survival. Eliza lowered her camera for a moment, simply watching, her chest tight with awe. She knew she was witnessing not just a story, but a turning point. Within hours, headlines circled the globe. $5 billion deal canceled in public after racist Gala humiliation. Carter Global redirects billions to minority entrepreneurs. The night cruelty cost an empire. Social media burned with hashtags Lancaster downfall, respect is power, Carter Global. The videos that had once been recorded to mock Maya now served as damning evidence of the Lancasters' cruelty, played and replayed with captions of outrage and solidarity. Within days, banks called in loans, partners severed ties, investors fled. Lancaster Industries, already fragile, collapsed into bankruptcy court. Their properties were sold, their art collection dispersed, their name dragged through headlines as a cautionary tale of arrogance and downfall. Charles, once the proud patriarch, signed papers in silence while his lawyers avoided his eyes. Margaret, who had built her life on social dominance, found the doors of clubs and charities slammed shut in her face. Victoria took a job at a law firm, learning for the first time in her life to answer phones instead of being photographed. Brandon, his drunken rant about reverse racism replayed millions of times online, could not find work at all. He lived in a cramped apartment, his phone silent, his so-called friends gone. A year later, the Metropolitan Art Hall hosted another gala. This time, the banners celebrated the Minority Business Partnership Fund that had been seeded by the very money once promised to the Lancasters. Entrepreneurs of every background filled the hall, their companies thriving, their futures brighter. The chandeliers sparkled again, but the laughter was different, warmer, genuine, free of malice. At the center of it all, Maya stood in a new gown, elegant and unstained, her presence commanding without a word. She greeted young business owners with handshakes and hugs, her smile soft but resolute. Eliza stood nearby, notebook in hand, documenting the night. She watched as people gathered not to mock Maya, but to celebrate her, to honor the woman who had endured cruelty and turned it into opportunity for countless others. Eliza thought of the night a year ago, of the cold air outside the doors, of Maya's patience, her silence, her final words. She realized then that the stain on Maya's dress had not been a mark of shame, but a mark of history. When the evening drew to a close, Maya stood by the same staircase where she had once been mocked and humiliated. She looked out across the room and saw not cruelty but possibility. She let herself smile, just a little. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. Respect is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And those who fail to understand that pay with more than money, they pay with everything they thought made them untouchable. The Lancasters had paid their price, and the world would never forget the night their arrogance collapsed under the quiet, unshakable dignity of Maya Carter.